Have you ever wondered why there aren't any new superheroes? The best superhero projects this year so far are X-Men '97 and Deadpool and Wolverine.
The first one is a sequel to a series from 27 years ago, based on characters that first appeared in the 60s.
And the second is a movie about two mutants who have appeared in live action multiple times. Hugh Jackman has been playing Wolverine since the 2000s, and the character debuted in the comics in 1974.
I love Wolverine, but he's far from being a new character. The next live action projects from Marvel and DC won't star new characters either. The Fantastic Four have decades of history, so does Captain America, Spider-Man, and let's not even get started on Batman or Superman. All these projects might be great, but we've been seeing the same stories over and over again for years.
It's as if Marvel, DC, and others couldn't think of anything new and could only recycle characters that people already like.
Where did you come up with that original idea?
This lack of new superheroes is no coincidence. Today in Mr. Headcannon, we'll explain the two reasons why Marvel and DC
won't make any new superheroes. First reason.
Superheroes don't come out of thin air. They are made up by writers with a big imagination, and it's not that there aren't any talented writers today or that everything's already been done.
The problem is that Marvel and DC have very strict rules regarding the rights to their characters.
Rules that are pretty discouraging for any creative who wants to tell an original story.
The rights to all the characters belong to the publishers, not their creators.
I don't understand.
Let's see an example. In the early 80s, a writer named Alan Moore, who would go on to become one of the best writers in history, wanted to write a comic using characters that DC had just acquired from another publisher. These included Peacemaker, Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, and The Question. When Moore's script was reviewed, the editor at DC suggested he create new characters for that story because several of them were going to die in this comic.
And DC had spent quite a bit of money buying those characters.
Moore rewrote the script with characters created from scratch by him and Dave Gibbons, the artist of Watchmen. It seemed like a great idea because they would have more creative freedom, and they struck a deal with the publisher.
They would retain the rights to all the Watchmen characters once the comic stopped being published by DC. Moore and Gibbons would be able to do whatever they wanted with their characters, which made sense because they invented them.
But sadly, that didn't happen.
Why not?
Back then, it was extremely rare for a comic book to be reprinted. If it sold out, and you'd never find it again.
But Watchmen was such a huge success that DC never stopped reprinting it, and the rights never left the publisher.
Moore and Gibbons were left with nothing. They never used the Watchmen characters again and lost all creative control. They had nothing to do with Zack Snyder's live-action adaptation, the spin-offs, Doomsday Clock, or the animated adaptation coming this year. The characters belong to DC, not their creators.
Is that clear?
This case taught a lesson to every writer in the industry. No one wanted to go through what happened to Moore, who felt so betrayed by DC that he never worked for them again.
Who would want to create new characters if you're not going to get royalties, or decide what happens with your characters?
And it gets worse. Sometimes the creators don't even get recognition. The Hawkeye series is heavily inspired by The Run by Matt Fraction and David Aja. The characters behave the same way. Their dynamic is identical. They're in the same situations.
And the show's opening is right out from the comic, but Aja's name is nowhere to be seen.
Matt Fraction was invited to the premiere, but Aja was completely ignored, even though he made half the work.
Not only did Marvel not pay him what he was owed for creating the comic the show was based on, they didn't even say thank you.
That's not fair.
This makes it so that the most important writers don't even bother trying to create new characters. Instead, they create their version of the X-Men or the Fantastic Four. They give these characters their touch.
And once they've made a name for themselves, they move on to an independent publisher, like Image Comics, where they retain the rights to their characters. There, they have more creative freedom, and the characters are theirs forever.
Todd McFarlane, the creator of Spawn, owns the rights to Spawn because he created it while working for Image. This means he gets a cut of the money from the action figures, the merchandise, every single TV show, and the upcoming live-action movie he wants to make. Plus, McFarlane decides what happens with his character because it belongs to him. He can license it out to someone else, but ultimately, it's his character.
You are mine now. You belong to me.
But well, that happens in the comics. Movies must be different, right?
The truth is, no, it's the same story. Do you remember Michael Keaton's Batman appearance in The Flash? It was one of the best parts of the movie, but Tim Burton didn't like it one bit. Burton directed the 1989 film and Batman Returns, where Keaton played Batman, but the director doesn't own that version of the character. Warner not only didn't pay him for continuing Keaton's story in The Flash, but they didn't even ask if he was okay with them using the character.
They didn't even consult him because the character belongs to Warner. They are the ones who have the rights to every single DC character, not the writers, directors, or actors. No one working for Marvel or DC wants to create a new character in the movies because everyone knows they'd be giving away the rights to these companies.
We don't want that to happen.
But wait, what about the independents? Why aren't there more examples like Todd McFarlane with Spawn. We have Invincible, which was created by Robert Kirkman, the writer of The Walking Dead.
But Mark Grayson barely counts as a new character because he first appeared in 2003, more than 20 years ago. We could consider the show as something new because it breaks several genre cliches, and we'd never seen Invincible outside of comics. But this is an exception.
Many writers who leave Marvel and DC to create their own characters often avoid superheroes to avoid comparisons with Marvel and DC, and because readers of publishers like Image are looking for something different from what they can read at Marvel and DC, not more superheroes.
I can't find a flaw in his logic.
But there's something that still doesn't make sense.
How is it that no studio outside of Disney and Warner tries new things like Image does in the comics?
There are very few examples of superhero stories in live action or animation that aren't from Marvel or DC.
Brightburn has some superhero elements. Megamind is great, but it's 14 years old, and The Incredibles is fantastic, but it's 24 years old.
The second reason explains all of this. The US production model for entertainment is based on doing the same thing over and over again, trying to replicate the successes of franchises that have already worked in the past instead of creating new franchises. This affects superheroes and every single movie genre, but it especially affects Hollywood live action films.
That's why we're going to see 2 new versions of Alien, a franchise from the 70s. That's why we keep seeing Star Wars projects, a franchise also from the 70s. That's why James Cameron wants to reboot Terminator, a franchise from the 80s. That's why there's a new adaptation of Dune, a book from the 60s. And that's why Marvel and DC keep milking Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man, who are the most profitable established superheroes.
All they care about is money.
We live in an era of recycled franchises because it's easier to create a spin-off of an established franchise than to invent something completely new and risk it not working.
Maybe no one liked The Acolyte, but trust me, no one would have watched that show if it hadn't been Star Wars related.
Had it been something completely new, no one would have talked about it, no matter how bad it was. Still don't believe me? Let's look at the highest grossing movies of last year. Barbie, adaptation of a doll that's been around for 50 years.
Mario, animated adaptation of a video game that has been around since 1985.
Oppenheimer,
Biopic of an event from the 40s. Guardians of the Galaxy 3, third part of a saga. Fast X, sequel. Across the Spider-Verse, sequel. Wonka, third adaptation of a book from the 60s. The Little Mermaid, adaptation of a 90s animated film, which was itself an adaptation of much older books.
Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, sequel. Elemental, something original. Of the 10 highest grossing movies last year, only one was an original project, and it wasn't a big hit. It barely managed to be profitable.
That's not fair.
This recycling process creates a vicious cycle where Hollywood only recycles franchises that were successful in the past, and part of the audience gets used to always seeing the same thing, so they keep asking for the same thing. And when someone comes up with a new story, no one goes to the cinema to watch it. The creator is fantastic and is a completely new sci-fi story, but no one watched it.
Ask yourself this.
If Marvel or DC introduced new superheroes in movies, would anyone care? Or are you more excited to see the same old ones, like the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Batman?
Answer me!
And I know what you're thinking.
What about Miles Morales, Kamala Khan, Kahori, Punchline, or Gwenpool? They're new characters, right? Well, not really.
We can divide these characters into 3 groups: the good knockoffs, merges, and the ones no one cares about. In the first group, we have Miles and Kamala. Miles debuted in 2011 and Kamala in 2013. They became quite popular, to the point where Miles starred in 2 super successful animated films, and Kamala had her own series on Disney+. But there's a bit of a catch. Both Miles and Kamala are new versions of characters that already existed. Miles' superhero identity is Spider-Man, a character from the 60s. And yes, I know Miles has a new design, his own story, and even some of his powers are different from Peter Parker's, but he's still called Spider-Man. He doesn't have a new name. Brian Michael Bendis, Miles Morales' creator, needed to use Spider-Man's popularity to introduce a new character.
I hate cheap knockoffs.
The same thing happens with Miss Marvel. Kamala Khan has nothing to do with Captain Marvel because her origin and powers are completely different, but she uses Carol Danvers' former codename. They didn't give her a new name because they wanted to link the 2 characters. It's like Miles and Kamala are expensive knockoffs of popular characters, not completely new characters. In the second group, the merged characters, we have Gwenpool or Spider-Hulk. Gwenpool debuted in 2015, 9 years ago, so she could be considered a relatively new character. Despite having a design design very similar to Deadpool's, but with Spider-Gwen's colors, Gwenpool has her own set of powers, which include reality bending and panel manipulation. She can literally manipulate what happens in comic book pages, so she's basically a god.
Wow.
The problem is, Gwenpool is actually a fusion of two pre-existing characters that were also quite popular, Spider-Gwen and Deadpool. To make things worse, Spider-Gwen is the superhero version of Gwen Stacy, who debuted in the 60s. So no, she's not new. And then we have the third group, in which we have the characters no one cares about. Here we have Punchline, who is a cooler version of Harley Quinn, Kahori, who debuted in season 2 of What If, or Naomi, who had her own TV show. Technically, these are new characters with their own origin stories, and they have nothing to do with pre-established characters.
Prove it.
Punchline was a student who became obsessed with the Joker and later on became his new girlfriend. I know this sounds very similar to Harley Quinn's origin story, but James Tynion IV, who created Punchline, explained he thought of the character as the exact opposite of Harley Quinn. Punchline doesn't try to be funny, and she's not emotional.
She is a serial killer who is serious most of the time, and also the Joker actually cares for her, something that never happened with Harley Quinn. The thing is, she's not a relevant character. She almost vanished once James Tynion stopped writing Batman comics, and the same goes to the other characters in this group. I doubt Kahori will have any relevant role in the MCU moving forward, and no one watched Naomi's TV show.
I'm not gonna watch it.
Maybe Marvel and DC can try to introduce some new characters from time to time, but their intentions are irrelevant because no one seems to care.
This is a huge problem for the entire superhero genre, especially live action. Marvel and DC want to tell stories in shared universes, but since they can't create new superheroes, they're forced to constantly reboot their universes because actors age and can no longer play the same characters. We talk about the consequences of that in this video over here.
Bye.